an associate professor at the School of Information and Library Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I'd like to speak to you today about story and storytelling. It's a way of thinking about information. It's a way of organizing information, if you will. And I think it's one of perhaps the most powerful ways to organize information. But let's step back a bit and think, what exactly is a story? A story, if thought of sort of in general terms, is something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And just as this speech will have a beginning, middle, and end, and so I hope it in some senses is a story, I'd like to talk about how story can organize the various kinds of information that we have. But story is also a little more deep than that. It's about character, it's about a sequence of events, usually. It's about a progression of things happening. And it's a way to tie all of those sort of disparate pieces together into a unified whole. And it's that kind of approach where you think of information or data perhaps as dots on a screen, and the story is the way you connect those dots. And so you think of with, I usually think in terms of children's stuff because I teach children's work. But with storytelling, you think of these dots on the screen, and then if you connect them in one way, you'll end up with a particular kind of picture. And of course, if you connect them in a different way, then you end up with a different picture. And so it's how we connect the dots of information that leads to how we create, or the kinds of stories we create, and the kind of spin we put on those stories. But it's even deeper than that for me. Storytelling is not so much about plot. It's not so much about character. Storytelling is really a way to convey emotions and build community. And that's fundamentally, in my mind, what storytelling and story listening is all about. As I tell a story, it's not usually a canned performance. It's something that I create on the spot as we go along. I have a basic outline of the story in mind. But as I tell the story, it unfolds as I get feedback from the audience. And so it's not a rote or a memorized presentation. And it's really that emotional power of the story that we're trying to convey as storytellers, and actually I think often as teachers as well, and as information specialists. We want to get to the deep meaning, the deep power that undergirds and underlies the information that we're trying to share. That's what makes it persuasive. And so it's a way of taking all of these disparate things and weaving them together. If you will, another metaphor, because I think metaphors figure very strongly in the story. The story, then, may be the way in which we weave together the disparate pieces. And so if the information is the thread, then the fabric that we end up with, or the actual garment, or the cultural overtones to that garment, all of those things are the actual story. Okay? So with that in mind, the idea that story can cloak, if you will, cloak information and thereby make it more accessible, let me tell you a story. There's a great story. It's a Jewish story, and it's a story about two beautiful, beautiful women. And these two women, once, long, long ago, as all these stories happen, long ago, these two women lived in a small house at the edge of the village. And the two women were exceedingly beautiful. And one day they were having a slight discussion, and the discussion became an argument, and they began to talk about who was the most beautiful and who would be the most accepted by the villagers. And it began to get really heated, and so finally they decided that they would have a contest. And the contest was that they would both, one at a time, walk through the village, and they would see who had the most friends. And so they agreed. Truth went first. Truth walked out, and as she walked down the central village street, the people who were out on their lawns began to ease back into their houses. Some of them who were up in their windows closed the shutters. And by the time Truth had got to the end of the village, there were very few people left outside. So she got to the end and she turned around and she was thinking to herself, I'm going to lose this contest. What can I do to make myself even more attractive? And she thought there's really only one thing left to do. And so she disrobed. She took off her great robe and she stood there completely naked. And then she walked back through the village, thinking that people would flock from their houses to see her. But indeed it was the opposite. All of the remaining people went back into their houses. They closed their shutters and they disappeared. And she eventually ended up walking back all the way by herself. Well, she got back there, Truth did, and she met her companion, and her companion was Story. And Story said to her, well, how did it go? And Truth said, I can't believe it. There was no one there. And Story said, one moment, let me try. And so Story left, and she walked along. And as she walked through the village, all of the people began to come out of their houses. The windows opened. They came down and they began to talk and mill and talk amongst themselves. It was a wonderful gathering. She walked all the way to the end, people streaming behind her. She turned around and walked back. The entire village gathered in the center as she walked through. Well, she got back and Truth was quite humble. And she said, I'm sorry, I have lost the contest, and I realize now that Story is more powerful than Truth. And Story walked up to her and she said, it's not that Story is more powerful. It's just that nobody likes the truth. And especially they don't like the naked truth. If what you need is to get across your point, what you need is the mantle of Story. And so Story took her beautiful, multicolored cloak, draped it around the shoulders of Truth, and that time, when Truth went back into the village, the people came out, because now they could hear what she had to say. That's a story from the Israeli tradition, from the Jewish tradition. So what does Story allow us to do? As that story shows, it allows us to say what we need to say without appearing didactic, without appearing overly persuasive. And it sort of cloaks what we want to have heard in a beautifully accessible way. And so we understand the deeper meaning of Story and the deeper meanings of the information because of the shell that we put around it, this narrative shell. It also, if it's told well, it allows you to enter a different space. And I think that's one of the most profound things with storytelling. And hopefully it can be ported over into other things like teaching and information and interactions. But what it does is it seems to, at least this is the way people describe it, it seems to transport us. It takes us on a journey. It takes us to another place, a different place. It's a place that J.R.R. Tolkien calls a secondary world that authors try to create when they write, particularly fantasy, but any novel or any fiction. They try and create this world that lives while the author is creating it. And once it's done, it evaporates and goes somewhere. We don't quite know where. But while it's there, it's amazingly powerful. It's very engaging, very immersive, and there's a struggle to get in oftentimes, but once you let go, you tumble into the story, you fall into, you're pulled into the story. There's an impetus there that pulls you along. And it's more, though, than this sort of willing suspension of disbelief that we have heard probably ad nauseum now. I think it's more than that. It's not that we say, I will agree to this and allow it to happen to me. There's actually an effort. And there are a number of research studies that show this, that we have to work on our own part to get involved in a story. And when we do, when we're willing to make that kind of effort, then at some point, the story takes over, and it pulls us along. So there's almost a push to begin with and a pull thereafter that makes story listening engaging and deeply immersive. And when we get there, when we get into that space, we really experience it as though it were real. And listeners all throughout the nation have talked about the sense that when they are immersed in a story, it is as if it is going on around them. They're that deeply involved with the characters, that deeply involved in the setting. And actually, they are so deeply involved that their sense of time changes. It becomes very subjective. Some folks say that a 5-minute story felt as though it took a year to tell or hours to tell. Other folks flip it around so that a longer story feels shorter. But there's a distortion in our understanding of time that is very intriguing. In short, what happens is that we enter, I believe, an altered state of consciousness. It's fairly light. It's not a deep one. But it is discretely different, qualitatively different from our normal waking state. I'd like to show a model here that will give you a sense, perhaps, of how this happens. This is a model I've developed through a number of interviews and readings, obviously, on storytelling and story listening. It's a model I call the story listening experience, and it starts numerically here and follows around from 1 to 7, divided into 4 main quadrants, 4 main quadrants.